Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Readout. Jason Johnson in for Joy Reid. We begin tonight with the breaking news out of Moscow, where a shooting attack has left at least 40 dead and over 100 injured. That's according to Russian state news agencies. This is what we know right now. The attack occurred at Crocus City Hall, a large concert venue northwest of central Moscow. Warning to our viewers, we are about to show some disturbing video. You're now seeing the inside of the concert hall where at least 3 men in camouflage broke in and opened fire, shooting an unknown number of people. Russian officials say several of these gunmen fired automatic weapons at the crowd. A fire also started inside the venue. Firefighters have evacuated about 100 people from the basement of the buildings, and efforts are underway to rescue people from the roof. Who committed this and why is still very much unknown. Islamic State, we know as ISIS, has claimed responsibility, but without providing proof for the attack on the concert venue. Their claim came from an ISIS-affiliated account on Telegram. NBC News has not yet verified the claim, but Russian officials said they were investigating the attack as a terrorist attack. Let's bring in Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, who previously was Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post, and former CIA director John Brennan. Thank you all, gentlemen, so much for joining us this evening. John, I want to start with you on this. The idea that ISIS or someone in control of the ISIS Telegram account has claimed responsibility for this, how credible is that, just from your experience? And what would be the motivation for ISIS to commit this kind of terror attack in Russia?
Well, it's a very credible claim, especially given that the U.S. Embassy issued a public warning earlier this month about extremists planning to carry out attack. And that term extremists usually refers to these fanatical Islamist groups. And ISIS-K, which is the one believed to be responsible for this, has long felt that the Russians have bloodily suppressed the Muslims in Syria, in Afghanistan, and in the Caucasus as well. And so, therefore, I think Islamic militants, it's very believable that they were the ones to carry out this attack. The fact that they just mowed down individuals, and clearly it was an effort to try to cause havoc and kill as many people as possible. And so, therefore, I do believe that we're hearing at least some initial reports, including from some American officials, that it was ISIS, which is a large group now. It has a number of umbrella groups underneath it that really was from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, in that area. And it looks as though that this was planned for quite some time because they were able to defeat Russian security services and carry out this attack.
Ambassador McFaul, it's both shocking and surprising to see this sort of attack happen within Russia. Almost immediately, we heard from an aide from President Zelensky in Ukraine tweeting out, Ukraine certainly has nothing to do with the shooting, explosions at Crocus City Hall, Moscow region Russian. It makes no sense whatsoever. Just strategically speaking, obviously it makes sense for the Ukraine to immediately come out and disavow any sort of association with this. Is that something that we can find credible right now? Is it something that they're just saying because they need to say this? Or would it really be foolish strategically for the Ukrainians, who are in a very bloody battle to resist Russian aggression, to be anywhere connected to something like this?
Well, I think it's very credible, and it's consistent with the pattern of the way that Ukraine is fighting Russia and the invading forces in their country right now. They're doing whatever it takes to try to fight back. They are striking targets inside Russia, what they consider to be military targets, and I believe that to be true. But they have never done terrorist attacks, at least to the best of my knowledge, against Russians anywhere. And therefore, this is consistent with them not doing that. I would just underscore that that's opposite from the way that the Russian government fights inside Ukraine, where they are terrorizing Ukrainian civilians all the time, including just last night in the capital city of Kiev. But Ukraine does not fight that way. And now that we have, ISIS-K taking credit for it, I think that, until proven otherwise, it should be the working hypothesis. And those Russians, including some former officials that immediately blamed Ukraine, that to me was a very shameful act.
And Ambassador, I just want to follow up with this. I looked up a little bit about the group that was performing. It's a rock band that's been around since the late 70s called Picnic. They actually were banned from performing in the Ukraine since 2016 because they performed in Crimea. Do you think that there was any sort of symbolism to this? Do you think that not just the venue but the band had anything to do with this? Or do you really think, again, it's more likely to be ISIS because it doesn't fit the strategy of the Ukrainian army?
I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I mean, I do know the band, by the way, and it's kind of a kind of hippie band from the the late 70s, early 80s. It's not a pro-Putin kind of group that would be there if I were guesstimating, but I don't know of any particular reason why they would strike there, other than the fact that the owner of this complex is close to Mr. Putin. So maybe that is why they targeted this particular place.
Peter Baker, I want to step back for a second. The world has made it pretty clear that they want to be on the right side of history. You know, there aren't many people backing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's not a popular war even within Russia. So what are sort of Putin's options here? Because when you have an attack like this happen, even right after a landslide election that he just recently won, does this weaken him? Are there allies that are going to come to his aid for an investigation into this attack? Where does Putin find sort of a sensitive or empathetic ear after facing this sort of attack, given what his army has been doing in Ukraine for almost 2 years now?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. He doesn't have a lot of sympathy, at least certainly in the West, not in Europe or the United States. He did, though, get a warning from the United States about this very attack. Not only did the U.S. Embassy say on March 7th that there was indications of some sort of a large-scale possible attack by extremists, including at a concert venue, but American officials say that they specifically talked to the Russian government about that, gave them whatever information that they had to give them at that time. So they did have help from the United States, even as we are, of course, at odds over Ukraine. But you're right to ask the question of what Putin does now, because this makes him look weak, at least in his eyes. He has historically looked at terrorist attacks in Moscow, which were quite common 20 years ago, around the time he first came to power, as an opportunity to, first of all, as a show of weakness on his part, which he needs to dispel, and use them as an opportunity then to make political moves that crack down on dissent. For instance, I was in Russia in 2004 when terrorists took over a school in the small town of Beslan. And the first thing that happened after 330 people died, including about half of them school children, the first thing that Vladimir Putin did after that was to, first of all, he blamed the West. And second of all, he canceled all elections of governors from then on, not just governors in the region where it happened, not just temporarily, but all across the 11 time zones of Russia. Why? Because it was an opportunity for him to say we need more central control from the Kremlin in a country where such a terrorist attack could happen. You can easily see him using this as an excuse to further clamp down on dissent. There's not a lot of room for dissent as it is in Russia right now. He's spent 20 years getting rid of that, but that would be his natural playbook looking at history.
Former Director Brennan, I want to go back to this idea that Putin had a warning, right? That even the United States said, hey, look, this could potentially happen. You're in danger, et cetera, et cetera. Just for the uninformed and uninitiated, we are on the opposite side of Russia. We are defending Ukraine. The Russian Federation is still considered a problem. There's no issue. There's no question there unless you happen to be a certain kind of Republican. What is the incentive? What was the incentive of the United States to give warnings on terrorist attacks like this to Putin's government? And the fact that this came true, does it in any way thaw relations? Are there any sort of undercover thank yous that are occurring? Or do the Russians just sort of ignore this and say, well, you warned us about something, but that just makes you suspicious in our eyes?
The U.S. intelligence community takes very seriously its responsibility that's called duty to warn. If the U.S. intelligence gets information about planned terrorist attacks against targets around the world, and it's credible, it's reliable, and especially if it's specific, which this was, we will share that information with the foreign services, the security and intelligence services. And clearly there was some significant specificity to this when there was reference to concert halls and in coming days. And so the timing of this warning, I think, was very much on target in terms of what happened here. I'm sure it was passed to the Russian security services. I don't know what the Russians did with it. There is a regular channel between U.S. intelligence and Russian intelligence to share this information. And so therefore, I don't know any additional information that might have been shared to the Russians. But I think, and picking up on what Peter said, I think what the Putin regime will do is to point fingers to a foreign hand in this and to blame outsiders for what happened here. But clearly, the U.S. intelligence had reliable intelligence either from human sources or from technical means that gave them the insight in advance for this attack. And it's quite unfortunate and regretful that there wasn't measures taken to prevent this attack from taking place.
Ambassador McFaul, this is the kind of thing that, under most circumstances, a functional democracy, right, would obviously, there might be an election called or something else like that. But let's look at, say, the last year, year and a half of Putin's leadership. You have an unpopular war in the Ukraine. You had a literal revolt of one of his most popular generals. You have shootings of important aides of his and sort of gangland 20s style, drive-by shootings, et cetera, et cetera. And now you have this kind of attack. Even with a sort of sham election just days ago, what is likely happening within the sort of political sphere of Russia right now? Are generals and other leaders beginning to question Putin? Because this is not a resume of a strong leader over the last year. These are actually both internal and external issues that appear to show a man who is losing his grip on his country.
I think that's right. Whether you'll hear that from a Russian government official, I doubt. You most certainly won't see it on Russian state television. What you're going to see instead is a rallying around the flag effect. We need to be tougher. And as Peter was talking about, I suspect, even more crackdown on civil society and various people, even more control. But already there's an undertone going on my social media channels from Russians, inside Russia, from outside, saying, if we're so strong, why did this happen? Why are we focusing on, phantom enemies like Nazis in Ukraine or LGBT activists when we have these real threats? And I don't want to overstate it, because this is a very strong authoritarian regime inside Russia. But that has already happened in the initial phases suggests that will linger. And that is a problem for Vladimir Putin. It reminds me a little bit of the debate we saw that has been developing inside Israel. Of course, everybody rallied after October 7th against that horrific terrorist attack. But then people began to ask questions. Why did it happen? The big difference, of course, is that Israel is a democracy and open society. Russia is not. But I think that will linger for Putin. This is not a good look for him, especially when he just told everybody that he's this strong leader that everybody allegedly supported in the elections just last week.
Yeah, it seems like his only strength is eliminating his political enemies after the fact, and that's not the sign of a strong leader or a dictator. Ambassador Michael McFaul, Peter Baker, and John Brennan, thank you so much for starting us off on the show today on The ReidOut.